The sun hung low in the sky, its orange glow casting long shadows across the barren land. The desert stretched endlessly, a sea of dust and scrub, dotted only by jagged hills and the faint silhouette of a lone ranch. The wind whipped through the dry brush, sending dust clouds scurrying like lost souls. At the edge of this vast, unforgiving world stood the Hawthorne ranch, a weather-beaten farmhouse that had known better days. Inside, Ruth Hawthorne moved through the quiet, her boots clicking softly on the wooden floor. She had a rhythm to her work, steady, deliberate, as if the land itself had set the pace for her. Her face, lean and tanned from years of sun, was hard and unreadable, a mask honed by grief and solitude. The ranch had been her husband's dream, but after his death in a freak accident 5 years ago, it had become hers to bear. There had been no grand transformation after his death. She had simply kept going, tending to the cattle, mending the fences, keeping the ranch from collapsing. The land had no mercy for weakness, and Ruth knew better than to expect any. Her voice, when it came, was soft, almost imperceptible. She spoke only when necessary, with few words but great precision. Yet there was power in it, a power that few ever truly understood. It was not in the pitch or the tone, but in the control, the quiet authority that accompanied every syllable. Ruth didn't speak often, but when she did, people listened. And it wasn't just the menfolk she had that effect on. As Ruth stepped out onto the porch, the wind kicked up, carrying with it the scent of dust and something else, something darker. Ruth paused for a moment, her gaze narrowing as she scanned the horizon. She had learned to trust her instincts, and right now, they were telling her that something was coming. She couldn't say what it was, but she knew the land had a way of warning its own when danger drew near. In the distance, the faint sound of galloping hooves reached her ears, the rhythmic pounding growing louder by the second. Ruth's hand instinctively went to the worn handle of the rifle propped against the wall. She wasn't one for confrontation, but she had learned how to defend herself in a world where kindness often ended in bloodshed. As the sound drew closer, Ruth's sharp eyes picked out the figures on horseback, a band of riders, kicking up dust as they made their way toward the ranch. She didn't need to see their faces to know who they were. The Magruder gang. Word had reached her about their recent activities, robberies, cattle rustling, and a trail of bodies left behind like the remnants of a storm. The riders were almost upon her now, their horses kicking up clouds of dust. Ruth didn't move, didn't flinch. She stood her ground on the porch, watching them approach with the calm of someone who had long since stopped fearing death. Her hand remained on the rifle, but she didn't raise it. She wouldn't fire first unless she had no choice. Cole Magruder, the leader of the gang, was the first to dismount. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered and mean-looking, with a scar that ran from his jaw to his ear, a constant reminder of a violent past. His eyes, dark and calculating, scanned the ranch with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. He had heard of Ruth Hawthorne, of course. Everyone in these parts had. A widow, they said, alone on a ranch that was more trouble than it was worth. Easy pickings for a man like him. He stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel as the rest of the gang followed suit. There were 4 others with him, 2 of them young and eager, the others older and more weathered by a life of crime. Ruth didn't speak as they approached, her gaze steady, unblinking. She didn't need to say anything yet. The desert, with all its vast emptiness, had a way of making words unnecessary. "Evening, ma'am," Magruder called out, his voice low and rough like gravel. "I reckon we're in need of some food and water. Ain't much between here and the next town, and we've been riding hard." Ruth didn't answer immediately. She simply studied him, her eyes flicking briefly over each of the men. There was a subtle shift in the air, something that seemed to make even the wind hold its breath. Ruth had always been an observer, and she could sense the tension in the way they carried themselves, too sure, too eager for what they thought they could take. But they didn't know the land, not like she did, and they didn't know her. After a long pause, Ruth spoke, her voice a low, controlled hum. "I've got food and water, but there's no free ride here." She stepped down from the porch, her gaze not leaving Magruder's face. "You can take what you need, but you'll work for it first." Magruder raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by her response. He glanced back at his men, who exchanged uncertain looks. Ruth could feel the shift in the air again, this time something heavier, a dissonance that seemed to vibrate in the dry heat. He was sizing her up now, trying to figure out if she was bluffing, if she was an easy mark. But Ruth didn't bluff. She didn't have the luxury of it. "You don't look like much," Magruder said, his lips curling into a smirk. "But I'm guessing you've got more to you than meets the eye." Ruth's lips barely twitched in response. She didn't have to speak for him to know that she wasn't afraid. He could sense it, the same way she could sense him. And at that moment, something changed in the space between them. The game had begun, and Ruth was already several moves ahead. Without another word, Ruth turned and walked toward the barn, motioning for them to follow. The bandits hesitated for just a moment before falling in line, their eyes still wary, but their arrogance gradually creeping back into their steps. They thought they were in control, but in the desert, control was a fleeting thing. The wind picked up again, howling through the canyon walls as Ruth led the men deeper into her world, one where power wasn't measured by guns or gold, but by something far more elusive, something that had kept her standing here, alone, when all others would have crumbled. And whatever it was, the Magruder gang was about to learn that it wasn't something they could escape, not if they wanted to live. The next morning came with a pale sun crawling over the edge of the canyon, casting long amber light across the Hawthorne ranch. Ruth had not slept. She had sat on the edge of her porch all night, boots planted firm, her rifle propped against the wall behind her, and her old hound snoring at her feet. The wind carried a bitter edge. Something had shifted in the land, something that didn't feel like it belonged. By mid-morning, they arrived. Hooves stirred up the dust before she saw the men. The sound came first, echoing off the rocks. Too many riders, moving too slowly to be in any hurry, too confidently to be passing through. When they crested the ridge, Ruth stood, brushing the dust from her long skirt, and waited with her arms crossed. 7 men rode down, led by a man who wore his power the way other men wore gun belts. He was tall, lean, with a trimmed beard and a long coat that rippled behind him like a banner. The others fanned out behind him, some scanning the buildings, others eyeing Ruth with interest or amusement. The man in front, the leader, brought his horse to a halt at the edge of the front yard. He tilted his head, his pale green eyes sharp under the shadow of his hat. "You must be Mrs. Ruth Hawthorne," he said, voice smooth, like creek water sliding over polished stone. "You already know who I am," she answered. "Question is, who are you?" The man smiled, not kindly. "Name's Silas Magruder. Maybe you heard of me." "I've heard enough to keep a shotgun close," Ruth replied. A low chuckle came from one of the riders behind Magruder, but he held up a hand to silence them. "We ain't here to make trouble, not if it can be helped." He leaned slightly in his saddle, eyeing the old farmhouse, the chicken coop, the barn behind her. "Word is this land sittin' on something mighty valuable. Fresh water, steady ground, even some silver veins out east. That true? You didn't ride here to ask geology questions." "No," he said simply. "I came to offer you a deal. My boys and I, we're setting up a route through this stretch of land. Dangerous work, a lot of enemies. But your ranch, it's a good anchor. Safe out of the way. We'd like to use it." "Use it," Ruth repeated, already knowing what he meant. "For storage, rest, cover. Nothing much. In exchange, we keep the area clean. No trouble for you. Safer for everyone." "And if I say no?" Magruder smiled again, and this time it reached his eyes, cold, calculating eyes. "You could say no. But this is a hard land, Mrs. Hawthorne. Things go wrong out here. Animals break fences. Fires start. People go missing. We'd hate for any of that to happen to someone as respectable as you." Behind her back, Ruth's hands curled into fists. She had faced drought, storm, disease, and death, but she had never let another soul dictate her land. She stared at the men, noting the subtle movements, one fingering his holster, another watching the roof lines, 2 more circling slowly behind the barn. Wolves, all of them, waiting for a crack in the fence. "I'll tell you what," she said, voice low and steady. "You give me till sundown to think on it." Magruder's smile was all teeth. Of course. We're staying down near the dry gulch for now. Campfire'll be burning. Come see me before dark. He tipped his hat, turned his horse, and whistled. The riders pulled back, the thud of hooves slowly receding into the hills. When they were gone, Ruth stood still for a long moment, the quiet pressing down on her like a storm cloud. Inside, she sat at the worn table in the kitchen, staring at the empty plate before her. The air was heavy with silence, one that her husband had once filled with low humming and whistled tunes, and that her daughter used to break with laughter. Both long buried, but their memories were still strong, stitched into every board of the house. This land wasn't just soil and wood. It was a graveyard of love, loss, and fierce survival. She stood and reached for the old locket, hanging by the windowsill. Inside, a faded photo. Her and Samuel on their wedding day. He'd built a barn with his own hands. Taught her how to ride, to shoot, to patch a fence. Taught her how to read the wind and listen to the ground. He would have stood firm, even with a dozen rifles pointed at him. Outside, she gathered her saddle and mounted up. If Magruder wanted her land, he'd have to reckon with her, not just with threats, but with the will of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything left to protect. By the time she reached the gulch, the sun was low enough to tint the rocks blood red. The campfire smoke coiled into the sky like a warning. She dismounted in silence, walking with calm steps into the clearing. The men looked up, their card game interrupted. Magruder rose, clearly impressed by her boldness. You made up your mind. I have, she said. Well, I hope it's the sensible choice. I'm not for sale, Ruth replied, loud enough for every man there to hear. Not my home, not my land, not my name. You set foot on it again, and I won't be kind. Silence. Then a slow whistle from one of the younger men, disbelief thick on his face. Magruder, though, didn't laugh. He stepped closer. You got grit, Ruth. I'll give you that. But grit gets swallowed out here. You don't know what's coming. I do, she said, eyes narrowing. I know exactly what kind of man you are. Magruder's lips twitched. Then I guess we'll see each other real soon. Ruth turned without another word, mounted her horse, and rode back into the falling light. She spent the night preparing, not with bullets and rage, but with rope and silence. She walked the perimeter of the land, her boots whispering across dirt and grass, setting traps, oiling hinges, hiding her tools. She moved with the calm of someone who had done this all before, not the fighting, but the waiting, the watching, the listening. At dawn, she took a bucket of feed to the barn. Her animals stirred, peaceful, unaware of the tension curling in the air. She paused at the door, one hand resting on the wooden frame. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk called out, circling high. Her mind went back to Magruder's eyes. Men like him didn't back down. They saw the world as something to bend. But sometimes, the land bent back, and it bent hard. That evening, she sat on the porch again, her hair tied back, her boots dusted from the day's work. The rifle rested beside her, but she didn't hold it. Not yet. Far off, smoke once again twisted into the air from the direction of the gulch. They were still there, still waiting. She sang, softly at first. A tune passed down from her grandmother, words as old as the hills themselves. Her voice floated across the plain, caught the breeze, carried into the dry canyons and between the rocks. The song told of rain coming after fire, of a woman walking alone through the dark, of how even silence had teeth. And somewhere out there, the wolves heard it. By the third verse, she knew they were listening, not just with ears, but with something deeper. A pause in the wind, a note that hung too long in the air. That was her warning and her invitation. The time for choosing had passed. They were coming, and she would be ready. When the sun slipped behind the ridgeline the next night, the air turned to iron. The animals were restless. The wind had died altogether, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Ruth stood in the barn, her hands wrapped in leather gloves, her hat low over her brow. In the rafters, rope traps lay ready. In the shadows, tripwires and iron teeth gleamed faintly. But her most dangerous tool wasn't the shotgun slung over her shoulder. It was her voice, and she knew it. She stepped out into the twilight and waited. They came under the cover of dusk, just as she'd expected. 6 riders now, moving like vultures in a line. Magruder at the front. His face was calm, but not careless. He scanned every corner of the yard as they approached, likely expecting bullets or a fleeing woman. He didn't expect stillness. He didn't expect Ruth, standing there in the open, lantern lit beside her, waiting like a stone monument on sacred land. Magruder dismounted first. He walked toward her slowly, hand resting on the pistol at his belt, though it never left its holster. The other men spread out, circling the house and barn. "I warned you," he said, stopping a few feet from her. "You had a chance to walk away." "You still do," she said. Her voice was even, unshaken. "But I reckon you won't take it." Magruder gave her a long, slow look, like a man appraising an animal before the slaughter. "You think this is about pride, but it ain't. It's business. You stand in the way of something larger than yourself." "Funny," Ruth said. "That's exactly how I see you." A flicker of irritation crossed his face. He took a step closer. "I won't ask again." "You won't need to." And with that, she whistled. It was sharp and sudden, slicing through the air like a blade. The sound triggered the first trap. A barrel rolled from the roof of the barn, scattering glass shards and burning pitch in a wall of smoke between the riders and the front of the house. 2 horses reared, startled, throwing their riders. Chaos erupted. One man lunged for cover, only to trigger a snare that yanked him skyward, his legs flailing as he screamed. Another tripped a wire and caught a heavy beam to the chest, collapsing in a heap. Magruder didn't flinch. He pulled his revolver and fired a warning shot into the air. "Enough," he bellowed. "We'll torch it." "I was hoping you'd say that," Ruth whispered. From the edge of the coop, a hidden fuse flared to life, racing through the dust like a living ember. It sparked a bundle of flash powder she'd buried near the fence post. With a thunderous burst, light exploded across the yard, blinding 2 more of Magruder's men, who stumbled backward, disoriented. Ruth moved fast. She leapt behind the water trough and fired once, not to kill, but to scatter. She knew exactly where her enemies stood. She'd studied them the night before, memorized their positions, read the angles. Every corner of her land was hers, and now it was working against them. Magruder ducked behind a hay cart, fury twisting his face. "You think traps and tricks are enough?" he shouted. "No," she said, rising from behind the trough. "But conviction is." He rose too fast, aimed his revolver at her. She didn't flinch. That's when she sang again, not softly, like the night before, but strong, raw, a voice forged in grief and tempered in grit. The melody rose like wind from a canyon, a sound too ancient to belong in a woman so small, and it struck Magruder like a hammer. His arm lowered by instinct, confused by the pull of something he didn't understand. His men froze too, caught mid-motion, as if the song reached into their chests and wrapped its fingers around their memories. Ruth kept singing. She moved forward, her voice steady and low, telling of widows in the hills, of war and waiting, of bones buried under cottonwoods. It wasn't magic, not in the way children dreamed. It was older than magic, something primal, the kind of song that reminded killers of the people they once were. Magruder's gun trembled in his hand. "Stop it," he barked. She didn't. And then, slowly, one of his men, Willis, the youngest, dropped his gun. He stared at Ruth with wide, wet eyes. His knees gave, and he sank to the dirt. Another followed. Within seconds, 4 of the 6 were down. Not dead, just broken, stripped of hate, caught between the echoes of their conscience and the sound of her voice. Only Magruder and his second, Clay, remained. Clay made his move first. A brute of a man, he charged the porch, fury in his eyes, a blade flashing in his hand. Ruth sidestepped him cleanly. He hit a wire hidden near the steps and dropped into a pit she'd dug the night before. It wasn't deep, just enough to remind him that she'd seen this coming. Enough to make him feel small. Now only Magruder stood. He stared at her, breathing hard, his face unreadable. The pistol in his hand was heavy now, like it belonged to someone else. You're not just some widow," he muttered. "What are you?" Ruth stepped closer. "I'm every woman you thought wouldn't fight back. I'm the one you left behind at a graveyard, who kept going anyway. I'm what's left when men like you burn everything down. He looked at her, jaw tight. I could still shoot you. You could, she said, stepping within arm's reach now. But you won't. He raised the gun anyway, but his hand shook. Ruth reached forward slowly and took the pistol from his grip. He didn't resist, just stared at her with something like wonder, or fear, or both. The others watched in silence, stunned. Behind them, the barn stood untouched. Her home stood tall. The night had turned cool again, but the air was lighter now, like the land had exhaled. Ruth stepped back, holding Magruder's revolver. You ride out of here, she said. You tell every outlaw from here to Tombstone that the Hawthorne place is cursed, that its walls sing, that if they come looking, they'll find something worse than bullets. Magruder looked at his fallen man. He nodded slowly. They'll listen. You'll make sure of it. And he did. By dawn, the riders were gone. Ruth stood at the edge of the yard, watching the dust settle along the trail. Her land was quiet again, but it would never be the same. The wind carried the scent of dust and blood as it swept across the quiet ranch, the last echoes of the struggle fading into the distance. Ruth Hawthorne stood amidst the wreckage of the battle, her eyes scanning the broken forms of Magruder and his men. The once confident gang lay sprawled across the dirt, their weapons discarded, their pride shattered. Magruder himself was on the ground, his face a mask of rage and disbelief. His chest rose and fell in heavy, labored breaths as he struggled to regain his footing. But Ruth stood before him, her expression unwavering. She hadn't needed to draw blood. Her skill with the rope and her knowledge of the land had turned the tide in a way he hadn't anticipated. Now, the man who had threatened her, who had believed he could take everything from her, was at her mercy. You can't do this, Magruder spat, his voice thick with anger. We were just taking what's ours, what you owe us. Ruth's gaze remained cold, unblinking. You don't own anything. You never did. He glared up at her, his eyes dark with venom. This isn't over, Ruth. You may have won today, but I'll be back. I'll be back, and next time, you won't be so lucky. Ruth knelt down slowly, her fingers brushing the dirt as if she could feel the pulse of the land beneath her. You've already lost, she said softly. You just don't know it yet. She stood again, her eyes sweeping over the fallen man around her. Each of them had been defeated, but it was Magruder who had been broken. The gang might have been a force to be reckoned with, but in the end, they were nothing compared to the land that Ruth had spent her life protecting, the land that had given her strength when everything else had been taken. With a single, deliberate motion, Ruth reached for her horse's reins, her fingers strong and steady as she led the animal forward. She didn't look back as she passed the defeated outlaws, their broken pride and bruised bodies scattered across the earth. They were nothing now. Just another cautionary tale. The sun was sinking lower, casting long shadows over the ranch, and Ruth felt its warmth on her back. It was the same warmth she had known since she was a child, the warmth of survival, of persistence. She had buried too much of herself in this land to let it be taken by men who had no understanding of what it meant to truly own something. As she approached the barn, she heard a faint rustling from within, and her hand instinctively went to the pistol at her side. But it was only a movement in the shadow. A man, one of the gang members who had managed to crawl his way to safety. He had blood on his hands, but he wasn't a threat. Not anymore. Please, he rasped, his voice weak and hoarse. I'm not like them. I didn't want to be a part of this. Ruth stopped in her tracks, her gaze narrowing. The man's face was pale, his eyes pleading, but she saw no fear in him, only desperation. He had no choice, no will of his own. Magruder had taken that from him, just as he had taken from her. You've got a choice now, Ruth said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of years lived in solitude. You can go, or you can stay. But if you stay, you'll have to live with the consequences. The man's eyes flicked to the ground, to the men scattered around him, and he seemed to consider her words for a moment. Then, without a word, he turned and staggered off into the fading light, leaving the ranch behind him. Ruth didn't watch him go. She had no time for hesitation, no time to waste on the broken men who had thought they could take her life from her. She had work to do, a legacy to uphold. Inside the barn, the wind carried with it the sound of the creaking wood, the sound of a place that had stood for years, weathered by time and storms. Ruth stepped inside, the light of the dying day casting long, distorted shadows across the barn's interior. The animals were still there, calm now, unafraid, as if they too had known this day would come. Ruth's eyes softened as she looked over the familiar faces of the horses, the steady rhythm of their breathing grounding her. She wasn't alone. She never had been. The land had given her everything, a home, a purpose, a reason to keep going even when the world seemed set against her. It had been a cruel world, full of men like Magruder who took without asking, who believed strength came in the form of force. But Ruth knew better. Strength wasn't something that could be stolen. It was something that grew from the earth itself, something that lived in every tree, every animal, every stone beneath her feet. And she would protect it. As Ruth walked to the far corner of the barn, she paused, her eyes lingering on the space where she kept her tools, the same ones she had used for years to build, to repair, to survive. There was power in that, in the quiet work, in the hands that shaped and mended and kept things together. It wasn't the kind of power that could be measured by a man's gun or a gang's cruelty. It was the kind of power that lasted. She heard the distant sound of a rider's approach, and for a moment, Ruth stiffened. But when she looked up, she saw a familiar silhouette, her neighbor, Elias, riding up the path toward the ranch. His face was worn, his clothes dusted from the ride, but there was a smile on his lips. "You did it," he said, tipping his hat as he dismounted. "I knew you would." Ruth didn't say anything. She simply nodded, the weight of the day heavy in her bones. Elias knew her too well to expect a long speech. She wasn't one for words, but the quiet understanding between them was enough. "You won't be seeing them again," Elias added, his eyes flicking toward the horizon where Magruder's men had disappeared. "They won't come back." Ruth looked out across the land, her gaze fixed on the distant ridges. The night was settling in, the first stars beginning to appear in the deepening sky. The ranch was still standing, still hers, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the weight of the land beneath her feet, not as a burden, but as a promise. "They'll never come back," Ruth said softly, her voice barely a whisper above the wind. "But I'll be here. I always will." The legacy she had fought for was one of survival, yes, but also of something more. It was a legacy of resilience, of quiet strength, of the ability to stand firm in the face of impossible odds. And as long as the land was beneath her feet, Ruth Hawthorne would stand, too, unshaken, unyielding, and free.